Michael Jordan's rare encounter on a quiet bus ride. It was a cool, crisp autumn evening in Chicago, a city known for its towering skyline and bustling streets. Yet, on this particular night, the world seemed quieter. The kind of night where even the most energetic souls find themselves drawn inward, reflecting on the passage of time. Michael Jordan, the man who had soared above the basketball court in ways that seemed to defy gravity itself, stood at a bus stop just like anyone else. He was no longer the legendary athlete whose name was etched in history. Tonight, he was simply a man, someone whose fame had woven him into the fabric of a world that had always seen him as larger than life. After a long day filled with high-stakes meetings about business and his ventures, Michael could feel the familiar weight of his achievements hanging over him. The reality of what it meant to be Michael Jordan, the icon, the myth, the one whose every move was analyzed, was never far from his mind. Yet, on this evening something stirred within him. It wasn't the need to be celebrated, but the desire to reconnect with something he had long lost touch with, the simple, unremarkable moments that make up the everyday lives of others. He had spent years in the lap of luxury, surrounded by private jets, chauffeurs, and the kind of life that seemed so distant from the one most people led. But something inside him longed for more, something raw, something real. He realized that despite all the praise and glory, the constant whirlwind of events and the endless crowd of admirers, he hadn't truly experienced the ordinary, the simple moments that people like him could never quite grasp. So, on this particular evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, Michael made a decision that would surprise anyone who knew him. Instead of retreating to the solitude of his high-end car, he chose to take the bus. Yes, the city bus. He'd seen the world from every imaginable height, from championship courts to private boxes and stadiums, but tonight, he would see it from the same vantage point as the average person. The man who had achieved everything now wanted to experience what it was like to be just another face in the crowd, a momentary escape from the persona he had spent so many years building. As the bus arrived, Michael stepped forward and swiped his card, a gesture so simple, so unremarkable, yet profound in its symbolism. No grand entrance, no flashing lights, just him and the rest of the passengers. His hoodie was pulled low, shielding him from recognition, his face blending into the mass of tired commuters returning home after their long workday. There was no crowd waiting to cheer his arrival, no adoring fans hoping for a glimpse of the legend. Michael was just another person, no different from anyone else on this quiet evening. For once, he wasn't the man who had dominated the basketball court or the figure whose every move had been scrutinized. Instead, he was simply Michael, a person who, like so many others, was searching for peace in the hum of daily life. As he found a seat in the middle of the bus, his eyes drifted out the window. The city lights blurred together as the bus moved through the winding streets. For the first time in what felt like forever, his mind wasn't racing with thoughts of sports empires or business ventures. Instead, he was simply present in the moment, a feeling so foreign to him that it brought an unexpected calm. The hum of the bus's engine became a gentle, almost soothing white noise, as if the rhythm of the city was offering him the calm he so desperately needed. For just a few minutes, he was not Michael Jordan, the global icon. He was Michael, just a man sitting on a bus, watching the world pass by, and for the first time in years, it felt good. The stillness of the moment wasn't something he had anticipated, but it was exactly what he needed. In this simple act of taking a bus ride, Michael had unknowingly started a journey that would lead him into the heart of a story much bigger than his own, the discovery of a lost little girl on the bus. As the bus made its way through the quiet streets of Chicago, Michael felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The world outside seemed to slow down, the noise of daily life fading into the background as he watched the city's skyline fade into the distance. The glow of streetlights reflected on the wet pavement, casting long shadows over the empty streets. But just as Michael began to sink into the tranquility of the ride, something shifted. His gaze, which had been lost in the blurred lights, settled on a small figure near the back of the bus. It was a little girl, no older than 5, sitting alone in a seat that looked far too big for her tiny frame. Her small hands clutched a worn teddy bear as though it were the only thing that could hold her together in that moment. The pink backpack slung over her shoulder seemed out of place in the stillness of the bus, a symbol of the innocence she carried with her, though it appeared to be weighed down by something far heavier. At first, Michael thought little of it. It could have been a simple mistake. A child who had perhaps missed her stop and was waiting for a parent or guardian to arrive. He looked around, hoping to spot someone who might be looking after her, but no one seemed to notice. The passengers, absorbed in their phones or lost in their own worlds, passed by without a second glance. No one seemed to care. A wave of unease crept over Michael, something he couldn't quite explain. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes flickering between the girl and the other passengers, but the sense of discomfort lingered. The longer he sat there, the more certain he became that something wasn't right. There was no one around her, no parent rushing to the bus, no adult comforting her. Just a small, frightened child alone in the middle of a busy city, her face a portrait of uncertainty. Michael, who had faced the fiercest competitors on the court and stood at the pinnacle of athletic success, now found himself confronting a very different kind of challenge. The world that had once been ruled by strategy and precision had suddenly become a place filled with vulnerability and need. This wasn't about basketball or business. It was about protecting someone who, in that moment, needed help. His heart, often steeled by competition, softened in a way he hadn't expected. As a father himself, the thought of one of his own children being in such a situation filled him with dread. The image of a young girl, cold and alone, clinging to her bear as if it were her only friend, was too much to bear. Michael couldn't just sit there. He wasn't the kind of person to turn a blind eye, especially when the life of a child was at stake. So he stood up, the soft hum of the bus's engine now a distant background to the growing sense of urgency within him. With each step he took toward the back of the bus, the weight of the situation pressed down on him more heavily. His mind raced. What if she was lost? What if her parents were in another part of the city, unaware that their child had boarded the wrong bus? The thought that this little girl might be abandoned or forgotten sent a shiver down his spine. As he neared her, Michael's heart pounded in his chest. The bus was nearing its last stop, and still no one had come for her. No one had spoken to her. No one had offered comfort. She was still clutching her teddy bear, her eyes wide and filled with a silent sadness that cut through the noise of the world around her. He crouched down in front of her, careful not to startle her. The girl didn't look up at first, lost in her own thoughts, but as Michael gently spoke, her eyes flickered toward him. He could see the fear in her gaze, the uncertainty of being so small in a world that felt so big and overwhelming. She wasn't just a little girl on a bus anymore. She was a child in need of protection, and for the first time in a long while, Michael understood what it meant to be truly present for someone else. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice laced with the warmth and care that only a parent could convey. "Are you okay? What's your name?" he asked, trying to put her at ease, but also hoping to understand who this lost child was and how he could help her. The girl hesitated, her small hands trembling as they gripped her bear tighter. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke in a voice so soft, so fragile, it almost broke Michael's heart. "Maddie," she whispered. "My name's Maddie." The sound of her voice was a relief to Michael, but it also made the gravity of the situation hit him harder. Maddie wasn't just lost. She had been waiting for someone who had failed to show up. There was a depth to her silence, a story that was too painful to be told with words alone. In that moment, Michael Jordan was no longer just a man on a bus. He was a father, a protector, a witness to the quiet suffering of a little girl whose world had just become so much bigger than she could understand. Michael's protective instincts take over. As Michael knelt down in front of Maddie, the weight of the moment pressed upon him. This was not the kind of situation he was accustomed to dealing with. On the basketball court, he had faced opponents who sought to break him, but this was different. There was no competition, no game to win. There was only a little girl who, in that moment, had placed all her trust in him. His mind, typically sharp and analytical, was now filled with the only thing that truly mattered: her safety. He could see the trembling in her hands as they clutched her bear, her tiny fingers wrapped around it as if it were a lifeline. Her wide eyes blinked up at him, filled with fear, confusion, and a kind of sadness that seemed far beyond her years. She was so young, and yet here she was, alone, in the cold, uncertain of where she was or when she would see her mother again. Michael's heart ached for her. "Maddie," he said gently, his voice a soft whisper. "Where's your mom? Do you know where she is?" His words were meant to comfort her, but in reality he needed the answers. He needed to know how this little girl had ended up on this bus, alone in a city that was far too large for someone so small. But Maddie, after a long silence, simply shook her head. "I don't know where Mommy is," she murmured, her voice barely audible, like the weight of the world had silenced her. Michael's heart sank. The idea of a child waiting for a mother who wasn't coming was something he could hardly fathom. As a father, he couldn't bear the thought of one of his own children being in this situation, lost and scared. The reality hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a small mistake or misunderstanding. This was something far more serious, and he knew it was up to him to make sure Maddie was okay. He didn't hesitate. The raw instinct of fatherhood, of protection, surged through him. He couldn't leave her there, not in a city as vast as Chicago, not on a lonely bus that was headed to its final stop. He stood up, his eyes scanning the bus once more, but no one seemed to notice. The other passengers remained absorbed in their own worlds, lost in their phones, too consumed to see the child who needed help. The bus was nearing its last stop, and still no one had come for Maddie. Michael could feel the urgency in his chest. The clock was ticking, and they were running out of time. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He turned toward the bus driver, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold in his rearview mirror. Michael's expression was firm, the decision already made in his mind. This little girl wasn't going to be forgotten. "Is everything okay?" the driver asked, his voice filled with concern. "She's lost," Michael replied, his voice steady but his emotions betraying him. "She's been waiting for her mom, but no one's come to get her." The bus driver frowned, his eyes flickering to Maddie in the back of the bus. "Should we call the police?" he asked, his voice gentle but laced with the same sense of urgency that Michael was feeling. Michael hesitated for only a second before nodding. He had to do something. He couldn't just walk away from this. As much as he wanted to protect Maddie, he knew he wasn't a trained officer, and this situation was more than either of them could handle alone. They needed help. "Yeah," Michael said, his voice tight. "Call the police. We need to make sure she's okay." The bus driver stepped off the bus to make the call, leaving Michael with Maddie. He turned back toward the little girl, who hadn't said anything more since their brief exchange. She was still clinging to her bear, but her eyes were now fixed on him, waiting for some kind of reassurance that everything would be all right. Her tiny body was shaking, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, and Michael could feel the weight of her fear in the air. In a gentle, almost instinctive motion, Michael reached out, placing his hand over hers. It was a simple gesture, but it was one that spoke volumes. His fingers wrapped around her small hand, offering her the comfort and strength that only a father could provide. The action was something he hadn't even thought about. It was just the way he was wired. Protecting her felt as natural as breathing. The connection between them, though brief, felt profound. Maddie's tiny hand gripped his in return, and though she didn't say a word, her touch spoke louder than anything. She was scared, but she wasn't alone anymore. Michael had made a silent promise to her in that moment. He wasn't going anywhere. He would stay with her until she was safe, until she could find her way back home. As the minutes stretched on, Michael continued to hold her hand, his heart beating in sync with hers. He could feel the calming effect of his presence on her, even as the fear lingered in her eyes. He wasn't sure how long it had been since she'd seen her mother, but he knew that the longer they waited, the harder it would be for Maddie to feel the safety she so desperately needed. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the bus driver returned with a police officer in tow. The officer, a kind-looking man with a gentle demeanor, immediately knelt beside Michael and Maddie, his eyes filled with concern. "Hi there, sweetheart," the officer said, his voice soothing. "I'm Officer Reynolds." "What's your name?" Maddie, still holding on to Michael, looked up at the officer. "Maddie," she whispered, her voice still shaking. Michael could see the relief flood the officer's face. This was a small step forward, but it was a step nonetheless. Maddie was no longer alone. The weight of her fear had been shared. Michael had done everything he could to offer her comfort, and now, with the police officer there, he could rest easy, knowing Maddie would soon be reunited with her mother. For Michael, the events of the evening had become something far more significant than any championship title or business deal. This was the kind of moment that made everything else fade into the background. The chance to help someone in need, to protect a vulnerable soul, was a reminder that true greatness wasn't measured by trophies or awards. It was measured by the love and care we give to those who need it most. The heartwarming reunion, a mother's relief. The minutes felt like hours as Michael and Maddie sat in the quiet bus, waiting for the police to arrive. The world outside seemed distant and removed, as if nothing else mattered except for this small, trembling girl who had placed all her trust in him. Michael, ever the protector, tried his best to comfort her, his presence a steady reassurance in the midst of the uncertainty that clung to the air. Despite his calm demeanor, his mind raced. He thought about his own children, the endless worry he sometimes felt, even when they were safe at home. He couldn't imagine what it must be like for Maddie's mother. What had she been through? Why hadn't she arrived in time? His heart ached for the woman who had likely been frantic, searching for her daughter, unable to find her in the maze of a busy city. As the moments dragged on, Maddie's breathing slowed. Her small body, still trembling, had relaxed just enough for Michael to feel the weight of her fear begin to ease. The bond between them had grown in the silence of that bus, an unspoken promise from Michael that no matter how lost she had felt, she wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't a promise that he could fix everything, but it was a promise that he would help her in any way he could. Then, as if on cue, the faint sound of sirens echoed through the streets. Michael stood, carefully lifting Maddie in his arms, cradling her like a fragile bird in need of protection. He had never imagined that he, the man who had spent his life in front of millions, would be holding a child in such a tender moment. Yet, here he was, holding Maddie, doing something so simple, yet so profound. He wasn't an athlete in that moment. He wasn't a businessman. He was just a man holding a scared little girl, waiting for the authorities to help. The police car arrived, its lights flashing in the darkness, and a woman stepped out, rushing toward the bus. As soon as she reached the curb, Michael saw the desperation in her eyes, the kind of worry that only a mother can know, the way her hands trembled as she reached for Maddie, the raw emotion that poured from her as she called out her name. Maddie's eyes lit up as she heard her mother's voice, and for the first time since Michael had encountered her, a small, relieved smile broke across her face. "Maddie!" The woman's voice cracked with relief as she rushed forward, her arms open wide. Maddie's small hands, which had been gripping Michael's neck so tightly, loosened for just a moment as she reached out for her mother. The two of them came together in a reunion that was nothing short of heartwarming. The relief on the mother's face was palpable, her tears flowing freely as she wrapped her arms around Maddie. Michael stood back, watching with a quiet satisfaction, his heart swelling with emotion. It wasn't a grand gesture, nor was it something he could ever have expected, but in that moment, Michael understood what mattered most in life. Not titles, not accolades, but moments like this, when a child, lost and alone, is finally reunited with the person who loves her most. Maddie's mother, overwhelmed with gratitude, pulled her daughter close, not wanting to let go. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there. I don't know what I would have done." Michael didn't know how to respond at first. He wasn't the kind of person who sought praise or recognition, but the sincerity in her voice made him pause. He had done what anyone would have done in his place. He had helped a child in need, but seeing the depth of her gratitude made him realize that this was more than just a simple act of kindness. This was the kind of moment that defined who we are as people. "Don't mention it," Michael replied softly, his voice carrying the weight of his own emotions. "I'm just glad she's safe. That's all that matters." As the two of them stood together, an unspoken understanding passed between Michael and the woman. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about the bond they had shared, even in this fleeting moment. A mother's love, a child's fear, and a man's quiet promise to protect. In the end, that was what had made all the difference. Maddie's mother, still holding her tightly, looked up at Michael with a tear-streaked face. She spoke in a voice tinged with exhaustion, but also with gratitude. "I've been working 2 jobs. I'm a nurse during the day and I work at night just to make sure we have enough. I've been so focused on keeping us afloat, I didn't realize how much Maddie had been struggling. I just feel like I'm failing her. I can't do it all, and I don't know what to do anymore." The words hit Michael harder than he expected. He could see the burden she carried, her exhaustion, her worry, the weight of trying to provide for her child while still holding everything together. It was a struggle that so many people faced, but to see it laid bare before him, to hear the raw honesty in her voice, moved him deeply. Without thinking, Michael found himself offering a solution. It wasn't a solution to all her problems, but it was something he could do to make her life just a little bit easier. "Let me help," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "You shouldn't have to do this alone. You and Maddie deserve more than this constant struggle." Days later, Michael kept his word. He made sure that Maddie and her mother would never have to worry about a roof over their heads again. He purchased a home for them, a place where Maddie could feel safe, where her mother could rest without the constant fear of not having enough. It wasn't just about providing material things, it was about offering hope, about showing them that they didn't have to face the world alone. Michael's lifelong commitment to helping others, a new beginning. The days that followed the reunion were filled with an unexpected sense of fulfillment for Michael. The act of helping Maddie and her mother, of stepping into a role of protector and guide, had opened something within him that even his vast experience in basketball and business had never quite touched. He had won championships, set records, and achieved greatness in arenas filled with thousands of screaming fans. But none of that compared to the quiet, personal satisfaction of knowing he had made a tangible difference in someone's life. As the news of his act of kindness spread, many in his circle expressed their admiration. Friends, business associates, and even fans celebrated Michael for his generosity. But Michael himself found something far deeper than praise. The recognition didn't mean much to him anymore. What truly mattered was the look of relief on Maddie's mother's face, the way her shoulders had relaxed the moment she knew she wouldn't have to struggle alone anymore. He had given them a chance at a fresh start, but more than that, he had reminded them that kindness and humanity still had a place in the world, no matter how busy or chaotic life might get. He thought about his own children often in the days that followed. As a father, the thought of them ever feeling abandoned or alone filled him with dread. The instinct to protect and provide was a fundamental part of him, something deeper than all the fame or wealth. Maddie's situation had struck a chord with him, and in helping her, he had found a sense of purpose that transcended everything else. It wasn't just about fixing one person's life. It was about being a part of something bigger, something meaningful. It was about showing up in the moments that really counted. Michael knew that for Maddie and her mother, their lives would never be the same. They had been through so much: pain, loneliness, exhaustion. And yet, thanks to a chance encounter on a city bus, they now had the opportunity to rebuild. Their new home was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was light, and that light often came from the most unexpected places. For Michael, it wasn't just about providing a house. It was about offering them stability, peace of mind, and the chance to heal. In a world where so many people felt like they were fighting battles alone, Michael had been able to make a difference by simply showing up when it mattered most. The gesture was simple yet profound, proof that sometimes the greatest gift we can give to another person isn't wealth or material things, but the gift of hope and human connection. The bond between Michael and Maddie's mother grew stronger over time. Michael remained in contact with them, offering support and encouragement as they started their new chapter. He watched as Maddie, once so frightened and alone, began to smile more, her laughter now echoing through the home Michael had given them. She was no longer the scared little girl clinging to her teddy bear for comfort. She was a child who had found safety, and in turn, had found joy. One evening, a few months after the incident, Michael received a message from Maddie's mother. She had been working hard to rebuild her life, and she had finally managed to find some balance thanks to the fresh start he had provided. In her message, she thanked him not just for the home, but for the way he had cared for her family. "You gave us a second chance," she wrote, "and with that you've given Maddie a chance to just be a kid again." Reading those words, Michael felt something deep inside him stir, a sense of fulfillment that no championship or business deal could ever provide. In that moment, he realized that helping others, offering kindness in times of need, was a legacy he wanted to build, not just for himself, but for the world around him. The joy of seeing someone else thrive, knowing that he had played a part in their journey, was more meaningful than any trophy he had ever held. It was a realization that would shape the rest of his life. Michael, the man who had conquered courts and business empires, now found himself committed to something far more significant than individual success. He would continue to use his position to do good in the world, to support those who needed it the most, and to create opportunities for others to find the kind of peace and safety he had given Maddie and her mother. Michael had discovered that greatness wasn't just about what you could achieve for yourself, but what you could do for others. It was about making a difference in someone's life when they needed it most. And in that quiet moment, on a city bus in Chicago, Michael Jordan had found a new purpose. One that would guide him for the rest of his days. A legacy of hope, Michael Jordan's transformational journey. As the months passed, Michael's life began to take on a new rhythm. The bustling business meetings, the boardrooms, the basketball courts, everything that had once filled his days with intensity and purpose began to feel less urgent. The conversations with Maddie's mother, the moments he spent with her and her daughter, began to shape his understanding of true fulfillment. He realized that while his career had given him recognition, titles, and wealth, it was the simple human connections that carried the greatest significance. The decision to help Maddie and her mother had been spontaneous, a moment of vulnerability in which Michael had chosen to act from his heart rather than his mind. But as time went on, he began to understand that this was more than just one act of kindness. It was a catalyst for change in his own life. It was a wake-up call to the way he had been living, always striving for more, always focused on what he could achieve next. He had been so consumed by his own success that he had missed the bigger picture, the opportunity to make an enduring impact on the lives of others. Helping Maddie and her mother, providing them with a stable home and the chance to rebuild, had unlocked something within him. He realized that his true legacy was not in the trophies, the endorsements, or the fame. Those things were fleeting, and they would eventually fade. What truly mattered was the impact he had on others, the way he could lift them up when they were at their lowest, the way he could offer hope and kindness in a world that often felt indifferent. Michael began to shift his focus. He knew he couldn't help everyone, but he also knew that he could do more. He started by quietly supporting organizations that helped children in need, those who, like Maddie, had been dealt difficult hands in life. He partnered with charities that focused on education, mental health, and housing, using his platform to raise awareness for causes that spoke to his heart. The more he gave, the more he understood that helping others wasn't just a fleeting moment, it was a responsibility. But the most profound change in Michael came from the simple daily moments of connection. He spent more time with his own family, understanding the value of being present, of truly seeing the people he loved. He no longer felt the need to be everywhere at once, chasing endless goals. Instead, he focused on building a life filled with purpose, grounded in the idea that true success wasn't measured by how much you had, but by how much you gave. One evening, while sitting with his children, Michael reflected on the journey he had taken. He thought back to the day he had stepped onto that bus, the way his life had been forever changed by a chance encounter with a lost little girl. That moment had altered the course of his life in ways he could never have imagined. It had shown him that greatness was not just about what you achieved on your own. It was about the way you used your gifts to make the world a better place. As he looked at his children, he realized that he wanted to teach them the same lesson. He wanted them to understand that it wasn't the number of titles or records that defined a person. It was the way they treated others, the way they showed up when it mattered most, the way they extended their hand to help someone in need. His legacy, he realized, wasn't just about building a dynasty in basketball. It was about building a legacy of compassion, kindness, and service to others. In the years that followed, Michael continued to support Maddie and her family. He watched as Maddie grew into a confident young woman, no longer the frightened little girl who had clung to her teddy bear for comfort. He saw her flourish, not just because of the material things he had given her, but because of the love and support that had surrounded her during that difficult time. She had become the embodiment of resilience, a symbol of the strength that comes from finding hope in the most unlikely of places. Michael Jordan had done more than change the lives of a mother and her child. He had transformed his own life. In giving, he had discovered what it truly meant to live a life of purpose. And in the end, he knew that his legacy would be defined not by his athletic prowess, but by the difference he had made in the lives of others. That, to him, was the true measure of greatness. As Michael Jordan's journey continued, he found not just success, but a deeper purpose in helping others. His legacy became one of compassion, showing the world that true greatness isn't measured by titles or achievements, but by the lives you touch along the way. If you found this story as inspiring as we did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment of these heartfelt stories. Join us as we continue to share more stories that inspire and uplift. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know how you think Michael Jordan's journey has shaped not just his life, but the world around him. Have you ever experienced a moment where a simple act of kindness changed everything? Share your thoughts with us. We'd love to hear from you.